My name is Lauren Reese. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Wilson Center is a living memorial to President Wilson. Our mandate is to connect policy, practice, and research to inform smart foreign policy. My program, ECSP, has been doing this at the intersection of environment, health, and security for nearly 25 years, which is why we are thrilled to be hosting today's event, conversation with Alex Dehgan. Alex's career really encapsulates the innovative and transformative progress that emerges when you connect these communities. Currently, Alex is the CEO of Conservation X Labs, a startup for tech innovation for development and conservation. He's been the chief scientist at USAID, where he founded the Global Development Lab. He's developed diplomacy strategies for foreign policy issues in Iraq, Egypt, as elsewhere with the State Department, and he helped create Afghanistan's first national park as head of the Wildlife Conservation Society Afghanistan Project. And somehow, in there, he found time to write a book, the Snow Leopard Project, which you see over there, and other adventures in Warzone Conservation, which we'll hear about today. Today will leave you wanting more, I'm sure, and you are able to pick up the book on your way out, and Alex will be available to sign copies as well. In just a minute, I'll have Jeff DeBelko come up to get us started. Jeff is a leading thinker on environment, conflict, and cooperation, and has been for over 25 years. Many of those years, he served as director of the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center, so it's great to have him back home. He's currently a professor and associate dean of environmental studies at Ohio University, in addition to his role as a senior advisor to ECSP and a member of UNEP's expert advisory group on environment, conflict, and peace building. A quick logistical note about today: we are webcasting this event live, so when it comes to the Q&A section, I encourage you to please wait until you are called on and wait for one of my colleagues to hand you a microphone before giving your name and affiliation and getting quickly to your question. I think there'll be a pretty robust conversation. We want to make sure that we get as many of the questions as possible. So to kick us off, I invite Jeff up to the stage. Thank you.
I promise to be quick. I promise not to filibuster, because Alex is such a delight and literally has so many things to say by connecting some very different worlds. That's reflected in the audience here. It's always terrific when we have someone like Alex, and there really aren't too many people like Alex, who have been accomplished in so many different worlds. It means that the folks who come to see and hear and learn from him come from all those different worlds. And the problems that Alex tackles, they're not modest ones, right? Development, biodiversity, conservation in conflict zones. Those are really big issues that really require the different disciplines, the different expertise, the different sectors. And Alex is someone, not just because he has a PhD in ecology and a law degree and then experience in so many different parts of the world, but it really does require that. It's not often that we find it in one person, but it really is a pleasure for us because it's both an amazing tale, and so thank goodness he's written it down in a book where we can get some of those details and some of those stories, but it is also amazing in the insight that he brings. And so I urge you to both enjoy the story, but also we learn the lessons, and let's push him in the Q&A to hear from him what this means for those who are on the front lines of conservation. And the front lines are in very different places, some that we'd expect, but when we talk about and hear from him on Conservation X Labs, those are in some different places too, but nevertheless some real possibilities for disruptive response to these really fundamental connected problems. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't say it's. I was already in the tank because we went to the same undergraduate school. So I loved him from the beginning. But it's been just a tremendous honor to have him over the years here at the Wilson Center. So it's great to welcome him back. And Alex, we look forward to you telling your stories with a purpose. Thank you.
It's really an honor to be here. I do want to just recognize a couple of things even before I start. First of all, I want to thank the incredible generosity of Environmental Change and Security Program here. Jeff, Lauren, Lisa, Amanda, you've all been really, really kind. It is weird. It is like either a roast We'll see how the Q&A go, or like some sort of weird reunion, because I've got so many people from so many different parts of my life, whether it's Madagascar or Afghanistan or other places. It's really an honor to have you here. I want to just note that my mom is here. I really, she'll ask the most difficult questions at all. And was responsible for most of the book sales. And then also my wife is watching remotely, and my wife and family really sacrificed a lot just so I could write the book. It meant that she was a single parent for days and weeks at a time, because that's what it takes. Particularly, it took me 10 years to figure out how to write. I'm not sure if I got there. But it was because of her generosity. There's some incredible people in this audience that were part of Afghanistan, people that were part of USAID, people that were part of the State Department. Most of all, I just want to recognize that this book is my imperfect telling from my perception of an effort that was way, 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 way more than myself. We have one of my dear friends, Peter Smallwood, who's here, who succeeded me not only in Iraq as a country director of a program that I was running there, but then in Afghanistan, is a squirrel biologist and an incredible guy and former AAAS fellow, and just an amazing person who's now on detail. But the people first and foremost I need to acknowledge that made everything possible were the people of Afghanistan, who showed nothing but generosity and great work. Also want to just point out Mary Melnick's in the back, and she was the one at USAID who helped champion this program and create the opportunities for us. But also just the courageous conservationists of Panthera and WCS, and a lot of other multilateral and bilateral organizations make this happen. Finally, I just want to give a shout out to former colleagues who showed up in force from USAID and State Department, as well as other federal agencies. You guys are amazing. I would leave aid at 9 o'clock at night, and the elevators would be filled with people, even though we got paid to 5. Now, no one's paid, and the elevators, I'm sure, are still full for those that are there. You guys deserve far more respect than we're getting at the moment. So thank you. So why don't we start off? I'm going to just start off with, I've got a lot of slides, so I apologize. I always have a lot of slides. Anyone that knows me knows I show way too many slides. But the first was a picture that is a story I'm going to tell of a map that was in my office. And so when I was talking about a 4-country peace bark, which was Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and China, that we were trying to build across the Wakhan, the person I was sitting with, I can't even remember who it was at the time, said, well, what about India? And I was like, well, India doesn't border Afghanistan. And they pointed, so this is not the map, because the map I had bought and put on my wall from a bookstore in Afghanistan had given away the entire Durand line back to Pakistan and had all of Kashmir going to India. So India was a major border state according to my own wall. So then I was in this weird state of actually trying to advocate that the map that I had bought and chose to put on my wall was wrong. And some of our friends here who love geography will know some of the trouble that you can get into with maps. But that sort of summarized a lot of the challenges that I felt in Afghanistan. There were days I was arguing with myself, so to speak, and maybe Peter understands that. But let's just talk about sort of this biological Silk Road, and this is a concept. Some of the areas we're going to be talking about, I'm going to start off with an overview and then specifically talk about environmental security, because this is the program that we're here for, was the Wakhan, which was this piece that was literally a piece that was given to Afghanistan to separate the great powers during the Great Game. That's part of Badakhshan. That is the western end of the Himalayas. Nuristan, where we worked in the eastern forest complex of Afghanistan, and Banda Amir in Ajar Valley in the Hazarajat Plateau in the center of the country. Banda Amir was close to Bamiyan, where the Buddhas are. The people who are there are Ismailis. And then finally, in the far west, the northwest Afghanistan Game Reserve. And just to give you some ideas, a lot of our images of Afghanistan that we see on day-to-day TV, and this is one of the reasons for writing the book, was twofold. And I'll tell you what the talk is, and you guys can choose to go home now if you want to. But at first was, how do we change the image that people have of Afghanistan compared to what is shown in the media? Because the media does a disgrace to the incredible people, the topographies, the wildlife, the stories that are in that country. And then second, how do we actually recognize that conservation is not a luxury within this country, but is actually necessary for national security and the advancement of individuals. And Afghanistan has this incredible diversity of habitats, of forests, of mountains, of deserts, of places that look like the Grand Canyon. It was also a critical part of the Silk Road, and the blue on there are the pieces that went through Jalalabad or went up through the Wakhan, literally footsteps that Marco Polo himself took and identified some pretty cool animals. And we'll start with the Wakhan, just to give you an idea. What is the Wakhan for me? It is a traffic accident of mountains. Literally, it is this place called the Pamir Knot, where all these mountain ranges, the Pamirs, the Karakorams, the Hindu Kush, the Tian Shan, and the Kunluns crash together and create a spectacular amount of habitat. It is the western end of the Himalayas. And we don't see these images that are out there. And a huge chunk of it is actually roadless. And so the word Pamir literally comes from these U-shaped valleys that we see. And the teams that went out there, it took a lot to actually go out there. And in fact, we would have to renegotiate animals from village to village with every one of the villages on what we were trying to do. But these were the pathways of the Silk Road that involved crossing rivers so we could actually understand species like the snow leopard that were there. The other animal that's there is this really cool thing called the Marco Polo sheep. I prefer calling it the Princess Leia sheep, but it was written about by Marco Polo within his writings. Its horns are 6 feet long. If you follow the curve of the horns, they live in these large aggregations of single sex, of males, of females for most of the year, and then they come together and literally the animals crash together for supremacy. And a lot of the work around the Marco Polo sheep was done by a former WCS, now Panthera scientist, George Schaller, on them. And part of our work was to understand what had happened. In all these places, there were these historical surveys that had been going on, the street expedition of the Field Museum, the Great Danish expedition, that allowed us to have some baseline. But for 30 years, we didn't know what was the status, what was left, what would be the effect of war on these animals, just to show you some of the size of those horns and the idea. The Wakhan is really filled, and I'm going to go through this quickly because we're going to get into the environmental security issues, but with the Wakhi, who are followers of the Aga Khan, and also the Kyrgyz, which were Turkish-speaking nomads that segmented and shared the Wakhan together. The second area which I write about our efforts in the book was in Nuristan. And if you know anything about the Eastern Forest Complex and the border regions with Pakistan, you know this is one of the most difficult and challenging places to kind of work. What you don't see is that it's filled with incredible deciduous as well as coniferous forests through this area, that it's filled with mountains that have literally repelled invaders. And Nuristan is literally the land of light, or more appropriately, the land of the enlightened. But it used to be called Kafiristan, the land of the unbelievers. In fact, Alexander the Great thought that they were followers of Dionysus. They have their own their own dialects, if not languages, and their own cultures, their own carvings. Even their carpets are different. Instead of doing thick shag carpets and sort of the flat carpets, they would mix the motifs together, and that three-dimensionality of the carpets reflected the steep hillsides of the countries. And when our teams would go and do these surveys in the middle of winter, which we would use scats to try to figure out what was in the area, along with camera traps, along with other kinds of surveys, for wildlife, they would literally be walking sometimes waist deep or higher through snow on these impossible hillsides. Well, those impossible hillsides also help protect the animals, but these were also places that were getting bombed. And in fact, at one point, one of my team members in Nuristan called me up and said, they're bombing our camera traps. Do I need to check them today? And I was no. We had something else called a hip chain that was a sort of a thread that allows you to understand how far you've walked on a transect. And our teams actually got accused at one point of that was how we were identifying where U.S. bombers would be working. It was an extremely dangerous place to work. But what we did was locate ourselves high up in the villages, above the corridors where foreign fighters will be coming into the country. Nuristan is filled with really awesome animals as well. You have something called the markhor, which to me looks like a double unicorn, like double the fun. And markhor literally means snake eater, which is kind of and as far as I can tell and through searching through literature, I don't know if there's any evidence that it actually does eat snakes, so it's a bit unusual. But the one that really gets me is what I call the vampire deer, which is the musk deer. And just because it looks like Bambi with fangs, right? And the cool thing about, I mean, how cute is that and how terrifying at the exact same time, right? Like, exactly. But what's really cool is this is where muscone comes from. Right? This is where perfume comes from, was literally from a sac on its abdomen of which it would distribute these pellets that would then define its territory that gave this incredible aroma that was used as a basis of international trade. The other thing to remember about Badakhshan is that is also where, just your Trivial Pursuit fact, where lapis lazuli came from, right? That was the blue that was used on King Tut's face mask and across the regions. You have carnivores like the Persian leopard that are segmented below the snow leopard in this point. You have a ton of cat species in Afghanistan, really cute ones like the Taos cat. I'm not allowed to say that, but I think they are. They're super fuzzy. But we actually have a significant amount of cat species in Afghanistan. And again, we don't think of it. Afghanistan literally was a biological Silk Road as much as it was a cultural Silk Road, because you brought together animals from Europe that included things like the brown bear that you find in Wakhan, the Asiatic black bear that you find in places like the Eastern Forest, hyenas, potentially from Africa within a single country. And that is because that explosion of mountains, the intersections of all these different kinds of habitats, it became the transfer point, much like it did for cultures and empires. It became that transfer point for biology, which is why it's important. One of those great transfer points was a place called Bamiyan. And I think most people know Bamiyan because of the Buddhas. What people don't realize is near where the Buddhas were, and this is just as a reminder where Bamiyan is, and what is left, literally those tents hold the shards of the great Buddhas, the great Buddha and the smaller Buddha, is this really, 60 miles away is this really incredible place. This became the first national park. We helped set up for it. It actually happened under Peter's watch, which is kind of cool. And what you don't see, I don't think yeah. But I'm just going to point right here. Is actually an alcove where there was a partially carved Buddha that was abandoned, still in this place. Thank you. And you also have right next to it, that structure on the ground was the second most holiest Shia shrine in the country. And then on top, this thing that looks a lot like the Grand Canyon, you have this whole hillside that's filled with marine fossils, because this used to be the bottom of the Tethys Sea. And literally those entire hillsides are filled with those fossils. But what's really incredible is you have these lakes that make up Banda Amir. Band literally means lake, lake of the Amir, that are formed because of the presence of supersaturated calcium carbonate in the water. Now, if you've been to Mammoth Hot Springs and you've seen that ring, those pools, those little pools that are formed, those are formed by mineral deposits over time. And they're kind of cool, right? They're about 6 inches high. In In Bamiyan, they're 60 feet high. And it's the same process that forms stalactites and stalagmites within the country. This is travertine. Travertine was used in Italy for carving, and it is that presence of supersaturated calcium carbonate that literally is bubbling up through the surface around it. Nearby, you have Adjar Valley, which was the former hunting grounds of the king. A lot of the places we ended up protecting were places that the last king of Afghanistan had set aside as hunting grounds. Him and his grandson, who was the head of the National Environmental Protection Agency, were enormous advocates for the environment, and it's because of their legacy. And what happened is a lot of these places were ready to become protected areas, and then the Russians invaded. And we then had the Civil War, and then we had the US invasion. And it was only now that we could bring to these individuals the ability of finishing up that work. But we had to ensure that the wildlife was still there, whether it is ibexes or, again, Persian leopards that were there. But we also found people poaching the wildlife. The last area is Herat. Herat is another former capital of empires in this area. The region around this area is rolling, you can almost imagine as savannas. There used to be massive pistachio savannas through this area. A lot of it has been deforested in these areas, and you couple the effects of the deforestation, climate change, and environment, and there's significant effects. I had the pleasure of going with a guy named George Schaller, who's a legendary conservationist, and we were trying to find the Asiatic cheetah. And the Asiatic cheetah is I would make the argument, over the Amur leopard, currently the rarest subspecies, the rarest cat in the world. It is a separate subspecies of cheetah from the one in Africa. It only exists at this point in Iran. They're thinking about giving some to India to sort of extend its formal range, but we're down to 35 animals. And at that point, once you get below 50, once you get below 500, you're on a path to extinction. Once you get below 50, it's really hard to come out of that. And at that point, chance events, particularly car accidents, become sufficient extinction drivers, right? And these guys are ranging hundreds of miles to look for prey, and their prey base is being distinguished because of overgrazing and other issues. Well, no one had seen an Asiatic cheetah for a long time. We had done a lot of work to try to find them, and then we started seeing them within the markets, which made me think that either these are coming from Iran, which could be one where they still have a population left, and there's been some recent political events against some of the people doing this work, or that there was still some that could be found. And we would go and we did these surveys, and we would talk to people, and they would tell us that they remember hunting 20 years ago, but some people still believe that they were there. And we couldn't get into the areas where we're going because the drug runners that were selling essentially opium and then moving through across the border to Iran were too heavily armed, and they were essentially outgunning the Afghan military. And the Afghan soldiers and police were afraid for us to actually go into those regions, and they were afraid for themselves to go in the regions, and some of it was cut. But this was also an area where we had the onager, the Asiatic wild ass. A lot of these species have been hunted down, unfortunately. So 3 ways to look at conflict and think about what effects does conflict have on the environment. Pre-conflict is one. This is really how did competition over changing Afghan resources foment conflict or exacerbate environmental security? I'm going to use one example. It was a paper I wrote with Jean Palmer Maloney, which was on Iran and water in Afghanistan. David Leyland, who's here, actually his father was a attorney representing the Iranians, I think that is right, in the 1950s. This is a conflict over the Helmand River and the waters that flow from Afghanistan into Iran that has been going on since the 1890s. And in the 1950s, the United States actually moderated former Secretary of State. Thank you. We've got a few State Department people, I think, in this audience that might know that answer. moderated actually this and set up these 3 country panels and the positioning of water monitoring systems. And then what happened is we went into Afghanistan, and initially there was actually a great cooperation between the Afghan ambassador at the time and the United States ambassador, because we had essentially taken out an enemy of Iran in Afghanistan, but they were keen to see stability on that border. But as part of our effort, we were building up agriculture within these areas, and we were using tube wells. And the tube wells had one really unfortunate effort. This was done under Commander Emergency Relief Funds. There was a huge effort to push out agriculture and see successes. But part of the process is we started abrogating a treaty that had existed and was supported by the United States previously between the Iranians and the Afghans. The tube wells had a secondary effect, which was to drop down the aquifers below these underground tunnels that were set up for hundreds of years that were gravity-led, that naturally allowed farmers to irrigate their fields. So then those systems, the Karaz systems, actually no longer were functioning. They would have to drill more tube wells. They were drawing more water from the Helmand River. And the United States was trying to generate electricity and water by rebuilding essentially the Kajaki Dam. And one of the effects of that was where the Kajaki Dam, where the Helmand River flew into Iran, was a place where Iran had its greatest security threats. It was 95% dependent on the Helmand River. The people were Sunni, not Shia. There was a terrorist group there called Jundallah that was actually blowing up Iranian officials within it. And they were seeing these horrible dust storms that were actually coming about because of a lack of water, climate change, and a series of other factors. There was an enormous wetlands in the area that was an important economic driver. That wetland literally started driving up as a result. And there wasn't the thinking about the greater result, the effect of which was the Iranians started funding the Taliban, who see the Iranians and the Shiites as apostates, to blow up the Kajaki Dam and to prevent the United States from rebuilding it. And it was because we sort of failed to understand the environmental context. And this is a simplification. There's a lot of many reasons, but this is one of them, was understanding that environmental context within what we're trying to do. Mid-conflict, how are resources affected by conflict and post-conflict? Well, the impact of war is pretty clear. And this actually had a big impact. I kept falling into landmine fields because you get very excited when you'd see a golden eagle, and you'd run out and you'd look around and you'd go, oh, well, this seems to have been the front lines of in Herat, and these are trenches, and maybe I shouldn't be walking here. And I'd carefully walk back, and it would get very confusing. The white stones are the only path that's clear to walk on in that landscape. And, when I first got to Afghanistan, people were demining next to the runways, that was my first trip in, and I was like, what is going on here? Erosion, literally the physical disturbance of the environment from the effects of war, the flooding of the country of weapons. And in fact, those weapons then led to people hunting many of those species that we're talking about. Plus, the absence of rule of law led to deforestation in places such as the Eastern Forest context, because while the Pakistanis had strong rules on the books that governed their forests, if they could actually get that wood from Afghanistan, they could sell it at a profit because it wasn't subject to the same levels of sustainability as we saw. But the other one was wildlife trade. And this was very interesting to me. And this is a story. And one of the areas where you see trade is on the Saker falcon in this region. These are animals that can sell sometimes up for $100,000 or even $1 million. Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan have some of the best falcons. And then the falconers actually particularly come from the Gulf. It's a UNESCO protected tradition. But they would come from the Gulf and they would hunt another animal called the Jabara Bustard, which is, if you have time, go on Google and Google the mating habits of a Jabara Bustard. It's a 3-foot bird that turns into a blind football, zigzagging around with its head hidden underneath its wing as a way of attracting mates. I haven't tried it myself. But It's kind of crazy. But one of the things that happened just happened by random chance, which is I had a PlayStation Portable because I was bored, and I was sitting on the plane, and the flight steward came up to me. This is Pamir. Pamir is really famous because they had one of their planes hit a mountaintop that landed and crashed into a mountaintop outside of Kabul, and it took them like a few days before when the shepherds finally told him your plane is up on our mountain, and then it crashed into a minefield. So they had to wait for the winter snows and the demining to get through it. But I was riding Pamir. They don't have that many planes because they would crash them. But the guy was like, I've got a PlayStation Portable too. He was the flight steward. And I put a video on mine. He was like, do you want to see it? And I was like, all right, sure. I'll look at your video. And this is the video he showed me. And let me see if I can get this to work. Unfortunately, the sound is not good. So I'm going to describe what you're going to see in a second. And in fact, what we might do is just break out of the presentation so I can accelerate this, because I want you to hear the video. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. This is the video he was showing to me. We're going to go about 42. And let's see if that plays the music. So unfortunately, it's not playing the sound right now, but what is going on is, first, some of these guys were smoking. And when did someone go, let me just get rid of the echo. Okay, we still got a little bit of an echo. Okay, still a little bit. All right, thank you. So Kandahar was an incredibly unsafe place, and they would go there for weeks to go hunting this Jabara Bustard. And so the thought was, who are they paying off to be able to have that luxury to go hunting? And in fact, there's a case in Pakistan a few years ago where I think they literally killed something like 10,000 Jabara Bustards during one of these hunting trips. There's some famous stories of how the United States had a chance to target Osama bin Laden during a similar hunting trip, but didn't because of the presence of some of our allies from the Gulf at the time, and we missed that opportunity. So this then said, along with something else, which was see if I can get going to the next slide, was we started looking and noticing that within the stores on Chicken Street and within our markets, there was actually things like tigers and Persian leopards and snow leopards that were actually for sale within what we're doing. So we realized that wildlife trafficking was a major effort that we needed to take off. And in fact, it became a huge focus. And for a long time in the old airport in Kabul, the only thing you would see flying in and out was our posters that would tell people, please don't buy. What we realized was that on Bagram Air Base, that this trade actually was not really being driven by Afghans. It was actually being driven by the international community. It was being driven by American military forces, NATO coalition-led forces, by the humanitarians who were there to help Afghanistan, and that what we needed to do was fundamentally change, raise awareness around what we're doing, improve enforcement around what we were doing, and change what we were trying to do. We started working with the airport authorities. They were incredibly generous to work with us. I started then almost missing every flight of Afghanistan because they would literally pull me aside when they would see me in line and say, we need to show you all the things we've seized, which was awesome. And they were super proud of it. And that was my responsibility. And we started working with the military police and training the military police into actually how to recognize species, how to recognize the furs, what species were actually important to conserve. But we did find Afghans that had participated within the trade. The numbers were really driven by the international community. I'm not sure who really needs a stuffed leopard, but that was something. One of our successes came when, like that tension right there. One of our successes really came when I got a call, and it was actually the traders, and the traders said they wanted to come in and they wanted to talk to me, and I was pretty sure, I don't know why I had this conception that they would have like the violin cases. I don't know why I thought that. And they would be like, put him down and pull out Tommy guns. I don't know why I was thinking, pre-Kalashnikov, but that they would just take me out. And we didn't have any guns. We didn't have guns. Our security was a little bit, we thought guns in some ways actually made us a bigger threat, made us a bigger target within what we were doing. There are many reasons for it, but I decided to take the meeting, and the thing they had asked me to do was to train them to identify which species that they needed to protect. They still had a lot of these stores, but that was one of the most stunning moments for me. Another factor was the poppy trade, but it was in a different way. It had an effect on the wildlife. There's obviously the conversion of land to poppies, but more importantly was the sources of addiction for people, particularly in the Wakhan. Because what would happen is, as people got addicted, their wealth was literally in their livestock, and they would trade their livestock for the poppies, but that still be responsible for the animal husbandry. And when you are responsible at that point, but you don't have ownership, you're less likely to manage the land within what you're doing. Finally, post-conflict, I think this is an important question of how do we actually have the luxury. And for us, Afghanistan, right, is 75% rural. So if you are not able to protect the land for wildlife, you're not protecting it for the majority of the people in the country. And overgrazing was a huge issue, as was the fact that we had, almost 6 million refugees coming in, and land management and ownership of the land became a huge problem within what we're doing. But we had something else, which was unbelievable support from the Afghans themselves. And part of the reason for which was that we made this argument that for people who have been refugees for the last 30 years, protecting Afghan wildlife was a way of protecting your own identity. And people took that and they accepted, they seized on it, and we saw it. We saw it in people's, unfortunately you can't see it, but this is in the leader of the Wakhi in Wakhan, and they've got ibex and Marco Polo sheep painted on their walls. Marco Polo, the ibex skulls were integrated within the houses. Even the names of places like the Panjshir Valley, the land of the five lions, reflected a respect for wildlife that we could tap into what we're doing. Ultimately, I was in the Serena a few months. I left. I used to work out at the Serena in their gym, and left about 6 weeks before it was actually attacked when I was there. And I was very happy not to be there that day. But I had this conversation from someone from NDI. And when I started describing what we were doing in terms of all the work, he said, you aren't building conservation, you're building democracy. And that actually sort of really gave me some important insights. For me, this is kind of governance in Afghanistan. It might be right now governance in the United States. But this was an important part, was that conservation, to work well, requires ownership and management by the local people within what they're trying to do. And one of the most incredible moments for me was setting up for Banda Amir the conservation coordinating committees, where each of these 30 villages around the national park or within the national park had to elect representatives who would walk for 2 hours to participate within what we're doing. And we had the national government, the provincial government, and the local government, and these local villages all represented, setting up rules and voting. And it was like watching the Constitutional Convention. This is Governor Habibi, who was the first female governor in Afghanistan, also won CNN's Hero of the Year. But these were the true heroes. This is in front of the, this was built by Asian Development Bank and really beautifully integrated into the landscape as opposed to taking it away. But these were the representatives from that government, from those villages, that were incredibly proud within what they're trying to do. Last thing really quick was we did try to work on this idea of a transboundary peace park that would allow us to have a massive protected area. Many of those pieces are in place, but we were never able to achieve this. This was an idea the Russians suggested in the 1930s. The first transboundary peace park is between Glacier and Waterton Lakes, Glacier National Park in the US and Waterton Lakes in Canada. And we had our first meeting in Urumqi, China, and it was hard. And the Chinese stood up and they said, well, there's no problem with wildlife trafficking and there's no problem with peace among any of these countries. And that was a bad place to start from within what we were trying to do. We were going to hold the second meeting in Tajikistan, which was becoming a logistical nightmare, but then the government changed and we couldn't do that. But it was this idea that if you could connect with countries through conservation, and this was something I did with the Obama administration on using science and conservation to try to connect with other countries, that it provided you a scaffolding on which we could base a more formalized relationship. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to talking to Jeff and talking to you guys.
A lot of long hikes and tea, sitting around having tea, talking with people in ways that show how these very small conversations can lead up to and connect to, well, enormous endeavors. And so we thank you for doing that and sharing that with us. You, as has been alluded to in a couple of times, you've sat and worked in, and not just sat, but been very active with conservation NGOs, with the State Department, with U.S. Agency for National Development, as a scientist, as a diplomat, and that at the same time. How do you, when you then translate the insights from this field work, so to speak, how do you translate that into the kind of advice for how our different sectors approach these issues, right? So what do, you got a lot of practitioners in the room, and you have a lot of folks who want to get there and be doing that. So they're at a stage of their career where they can say, okay, well, if I'm going to be like Alex, I need the PhD in ecology and the law degree, and there are a lot of things there.
Don't do all of that.
Right. So, I guess that's two questions. One, kind of, how do you see folks developing the skill sets to be able to see how all these things connect that you've clearly shown in this particular example? And then once you get there, how do we make these bodies of in government and out of government see those connections and work against them? Because as we know in this town as well as in the field, it's often hard to get these different constituencies and groups to work together. So you've clearly succeeded in doing that. Give us the secret.
One of my favorite things, and Lena may remember this, that I did just in terms of the last question you asked, was we had something like 20 to 30 organizations that were in Afghanistan that touched that national park in some way. And none of them were working together or talking together, despite super formal processes to be able to do that. So we set up a group that was called, I don't want to get too close because I've gotten fat enough writing the book that I'm worried that my shirt will pop open. So if it does, just let me know. Mom signal me.
There's a Superman shirt on there, right?
The super person shirt was all the people I worked with, and in particular the Afghans. But we did have this thing called the Unofficial, Unimportant Conservation Coordinating Committee on Afghanistan. And it had like 3 rules. First rule was if you're not invited, you are. The second is if you came, we had this amazing cook who could really make a great lamb biryani and Kabuli pulao, and you would get a free lunch. And not only would you get a free lunch, you would get all of our data, which we had spent a lot of time collecting, including getting these historical records of animals, all our reports, all our GIS data that perhaps we weren't licensed to distribute, but we wanted to share, and we would tell you everything we were up to. And then the third was that the organization had 0 power and 0 status. And so if anyone claimed any power, we'd immediately reject that it had any power. And it became a super highly effective coordinating committee because all we would do was just, as people were shoveling in the food that was really good and they were getting our DVDs of information, we would say about what we were doing and go, how about you? And you would use the peer pressure, and that function actually really worked. I don't know if that works in every case, but it was, how do we actually get at what we needed to do? In terms of what you're talking about, in terms of the skill sets and everything else, I mean, the one comment I would make is, we need all the skill sets we have right now for diplomacy and for development. That we have. But increasingly, the challenges we face, whether it's climate change or food security or, what gene editing means, the merger of biology and technology that we're facing, what AI and robotics mean for this country, requires us to have scientists and engineers and economists and anthropologists and political scientists all as part of our diplomatic core, our development core for what we're trying to do. And that to me, and the second is, do we fundamentally understand the problems that we're taking off? For a long time in conservation, we believe the answer, including myself, have been national parks. But the fact is, national parks we need them, but they're a symptom of underlying drivers that are there. And then third is really this idea that behavioral science, and humans are in the middle of everything, whether we acknowledge it or not. And we have tended to fight against human behavior, whether it is in global health or it is in conservation, rather than harness it. And how do we think about doing that?
Mm-hmm. So you alluded to, and we mentioned it in the introduction, but Conservation X Labs, because in some ways you hinted at this yet other area, which is the entrepreneurship and innovation and some of the tools of the private sector that bringing to bear on conservation development. Is that something that you came to kind of after this experience? Did you see those links there, and how does that connect to your larger endeavors in this space?
This experience, so it was an indirect link, but this experience made me want to work for USAID. Both for the good reasons and the bad reasons that I saw in the field within what I was trying to do. And those bad reasons are clear because that agency was under tremendous pressure from Congress, right? And that pressure and the amount of money that they had to spend, it was not the individuals, but it was just, how do you deal with those circumstances, right? I've rarely met just better people than the people I've worked alongside of at aid and at state. But that being said, I wanted to bring science back to USAID, and to state, and I had the opportunity to be able to do that, whether it was through the Iran negotiations or to being chief scientist at USAID. But that also made me realize that conservation, my own field, of which I had served on the board of governors of the Society of Conservation Biology, was 20 years behind where global health was. Global health 20 years ago was a single disciplinary field, or 30 years ago, that was tropical medicine. And it was only when it brought in economists and anthropologists and engineers and entrepreneurs that we started to see a complete transformation in our ability to solve these problems. Conservation is starting to, but needs to go through that transformation. And conservation science, right, was essentially biology, and then they said, well, maybe social scientists and economists are going, and now engineering and technology is increasing a part of it. Conservation practice went from let's set aside this land and preserve it, and it will be Arcadia, and it'll be pristine, and it's never been touched, right? And we'll start from that. And then it started looking at, can we think about markets within what we're trying to do? Can we think about, second was environmental laws. Mm-hmm. So let's actually set up laws in the regulatory framework. Let's think about markets was the third port, and partnerships of the private sector. And now it is also convened on this point of technology. And that, to me, suggests that, for us to really be able to solve these problems, we need to have solutions that match the speed and the scale of them. And one of those areas where we could is technology that gives us this emerging democratization of science and technology because of exponential increases in power and exponential decreases in price that we have seen. And that's what we set up Conservation X Labs was, could we change the field and the people in the field? Not, I would say the problem of conservation is it's filled with people like me, right? And we actually need not only conservation scientists and ecologists and evolutionary biologists, but we needed sociologists and anthropologists and economists and engineers as part of our team. So how do we change the field and how things are taught? And then the second part is, how do we create the solutions that are not addressing symptoms, but replacing drivers? And what's really interesting is most of those solutions to our conservation problems are in international development. And we yet treat them as separate fields, but in fact, they're closely tied. It is based on food security. It is based on education and governance that we need to understand to actually make those successes work.
Great. Well, why don't we turn it over to some questions from the audience? Because we are webcasting it, we want you to wait for a microphone so the folks online can hear it. We ask that you make it a short question rather than an extended comment. And then I am going, it's a little hard to see, but there's a hand down here in the front and the side. So why don't we do a couple in front, if you can bring the mic here, and we'll move it around. So there's a gentleman here in the middle. This is the one I can see. Oh, go ahead, and we'll capture a couple, Alex, and then give you a chance to respond.
Hi, thank you for this informative forum. My name is Contessa Bourbon. I'm a freelance journalist. I'd like to ask, what regional cooperation do you propose that can be supported by US and Europe so as to preserve snow leopard, the cheetah, the Asiatic cheetah, and other endangered species? What regional cooperation do you see?
Terrific. And could you hand it to the gentleman just the other side of you? Yeah, thank you. Please.
Good to see you again, Alex. You talked about the framework that's coming out of McAfee and Thor of pre-conflict, conflict, and post-conflict. And I've begun to feel like that causes us problems because humans like to think of things as discrete categories, and what we really have here is a spectrum, and Afghanistan has never really gotten that far to the post-conflict. So first off, is there a way to modify that to help us think that through? And then the second part, given the direction of Afghanistan in recent months or years, what is your expectation for what's going to happen to the 2 national parks they have now?
Okay, why don't we take one more? Gosh, that's a popular aisle. Yeah, you can. Okay, go right ahead.
Aisle or firing line?
Yeah, no. Just the first wave.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the publication of your book. I'm Marisa Ensor, Georgetown University. I'm an anthropologist and human rights lawyer. And I've only just purchased the book, so obviously I haven't read it. But in case my question is not discussed in the book, what my question is, to which extent do you think that the lessons learned through your project in Afghanistan could be applicable through qualified extension to other conflict-affected regions of the world where conservation is or could be an important factor? And I'm specifically thinking of South Sudan, a country where I've been working since 2002, where a team of colleagues and myself are beginning to explore the possibility of mounting peace building through conservation project.
Terrific.
Thank you.
We'll get
Hi,
a couple more. I'm just going to work this aisle here.
My name is Preston Land. I'm a environmental resource policy grad student at GW. I'm also an officer in the Marine Corps, and I have combat experience in Southwest Afghanistan. And my question is, being there in deployment, we dealt with Afghans and Afghan institutions, both at the local, regional, and provincial levels. And one of the biggest problems we had was problems with corruption. So I'm curious, with corruption being so pervasive in Afghanistan at all levels, particularly in government, how did that affect your efforts, domestic efforts, international efforts at conservation within Afghanistan?
One more, I promise, and Alex will give you a chance to talk eventually.
Again, much food for thought. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. A question about science and its democratization, which I fully support, but you know very well that in many cases science is very hierarchical. In universities particularly, the struggles for grants and big science and big data. So these are some obstacles to overcome for people who want careers in science and see the democratization as a hindrance to their career progression.
Now it's your turn.
Thank you. Because I've got early onset Alzheimer's, I'll start in reverse order. Just on science, one of the really powerful programs we built, which Cameron Best actually helps run, is PEER, which was this program that was if you got an NSF or an NIH grant or were funded by the U.S. government or a U.S. government-funded program, USAID would actually fund your counterpart. And that became an incredibly popular program even when our funding was cut for it centrally because there was a demand, because it was about respect. And it was about leveling your playing field and allowing people to actually build. Science, I think this idea of hierarchy in science is changing. I mean, one, just the nature of the problems are increasingly complex. They require lots of different people working together. Second is we're seeing things like citizen science is actually being really powerful tools within what we're doing. When I talk about democratization of science, I'm talking about like a product that we're building, which is, you know, a handheld DNA lab that my 3-year-old son can use because it doesn't require you to be literate to have connected power to have reagents, and it costs $2 a test and $100 a device. That is incredible because it's replacing someone with a PhD in an enormous lab in the back. That's what I mean. The cell phone is a sensor that is a powerful tool of science, and the nature of science itself is changing in fundamental different ways. But PEER gives me hope that we can actually support colleagues through the West and build their capacity to solve some of their own problems. And there's a lot of other examples, but that's one I want to call out within what we're trying to do. The corruption one is really interesting because I had huge problems with corruption in places like Madagascar, and it was enormous. I had an agreement. I had collaborators in the Madagascar government, and they would seek to monetize at every place stage. Do we have time for a really short story? All right. So my favorite story was we had a 2-truck caravan filled with equipment. All our equipment was going to be left for the most part in Afghanistan with our scientific collaborators. They were trying to tax it at 100% import duties and lots of other things. But one point was late at night we got stopped by a policeman, and he was like, "You're entering into a it's not dysentery. We just developed a vaccine for it. What is it called? You're entering into the zone where this pathogen, which there wasn't at that time an effective vaccine for." And he was like, "I'm going to have to give you the shot." And I looked at the guy, and like clearly it was going to be a bad idea, like for him, and he was just looking for it. And I remember like pulling out my dart gun for lemurs, and I started loading up one of the darts, and he was like, "What are you doing?" And it was like, "It's amazing you mentioned that, because literally we're here for another pathogen, and the only way to distribute this is rectally, and I've got to shoot it in you." And the guy just looks at me, and I was just looking at him. He was like, "Just get out of here." And that was like day to day in Madagascar. Afghanistan, this sounds incredulous. I never had a problem with corruption. And in part because there's two reasons. One is my Farsi accent. Because I sound like a stoned California surfer when I speak Farsi, and those people who know including my mom, can verify it. It is the worst, stupidest sounding accent that you can imagine. And when I would give speeches, people would start laughing, at least for the first 30 seconds, which was a great way to break the ice, right? So like it actually helped build the bond within what we were doing. But the other reason was we would start talking about identity, and we would start talking about the importance of these animals, and people bought into that idea, and they did not bother us. They gave us the permits that we needed. They gave us the support that we needed, and we made it through. I would say incredibly luckily without having to do that. South Sudan is a great idea. I mean, WCS is in South Sudan. It is I actually addressed the new government of South Sudan when I was the USAID chief scientist, and really had great hope for what they're doing. I think Jeff can maybe better speak to the peace building aspects of it, but I again think it's how do you cut across language and religion, and other types of gulfs that we face. And one of the ways to do it is through things like wildlife. Across regional cooperation, it's really clear that water doesn't respect political boundaries except when we put dams on it. Climate change isn't respecting political boundaries. The Marco Polo sheep literally run across the border between Afghanistan and China, and that is I think it's a very powerful tool. It can still become highly politicized, which is the risk. We used a lot of science diplomacy and conservation diplomacy in Iran, and some of those people are now in prison. So it is not without its dangers. But I worked on Arab-Israeli cooperation, and even during the Gaza war, there were scientists in Gaza who continued to work with their counterparts in Israel, which gives you hope at the end of the day. Can you remind me really quickly?
Conflict continuum and whether that's useful or actually obscures some of the challenges?
Yeah, I think Peter's right? Like anytime we put arbitrary sort of discrete units on things, that becomes a serious issue. Obviously, all those things exacerbate security or have the potential to improve it. And so I'll go back to, what is your hope? What situation are we facing going forward? How do we think about that situation? One is, there's the Bamiyan National Parks. Wakhan is now a national park, supposedly. Kol Hashmat Khan is now a protected area as well within what we're doing. I would say Wakhan is a very different situation because it's so remote than Banda Amir. Banda Amir, though, is with the Hazara, right, who faced great slaughter at the hands of the Taliban, during the Civil War. Horrendous slaughter that I think has gotten affected. My guess is they will fight tooth and nail for the return of the Taliban back to those regions. But that still hurts tourism. And one of the things that's really interesting about Banda Amir is the tourism there comes mainly from the Afghans, right? That visit it because it is a shrine, because it is a place of great beauty. It is a place of great recreation. But like all these places, I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful on Iraq. I remain hopeful on Afghanistan. I remain hopeful for one reason, which is you and I and other people at WCS and other people at USAID have trained, great scientists like Zalmai, who's a scientist that is getting his PhD here in the United States, who is an amazing scientist and field biologist. And that is what we should be doing. That is, at the end of the day, the greatest change or the greatest impact we can have. And even as chief scientist at USAID, I would say the legions of AAAS fellows I helped bring in are the most powerful thing I probably could have done. The first question, what was the first question?
Regional cooperation for from Europe and the U.S. for Afghanistan.
Europe and the U.S. for Afghanistan. Yeah, I mean, so there obviously is a lot of regional cooperation, I think, on snow leopards, Asiatic black bear, and other groups with Europe. It depends on how you define Europe. Obviously, the Europeans, the Norwegians, and other donors, and the Swedes are great environmental donors historically within what they're doing. The thing that worries me is the Iranian cheetah, because I feel through the politicalization of what has happened with science diplomacy, and I feel through the increased tensions between the United States and Iran, and that we're not looking for the cheetah in Afghanistan, and we're not trying to manage them as a transboundary animal, that we're going to see the extinction of the cheetah subspecies in our generation. Just a comment on Iran, like when we vilify Iran, we are vilifying Iran is best defined by government, by cacophony, right? It looks a lot like the Buzkashi picture that I showed, the forerunner of polo, right? Where literally there are multiple people vying for some sort of control. When we vilify the people we're working with, we've strengthened the hardliners, and they are allowed then to undercut these science diplomacy efforts that people have been doing for a long time.
Yeah, you'd think eventually we'd learn that lesson. Okay, why don't we work on this side of that room? The gentleman right there. Yep, thank you.
Hi, Malcolm Odell. I'm working on the Great Himalayan Trail project to bring about governance and conservation across the 500 miles of Nepal. We started in Makalu. Well, I started in Afghanistan and Pakistan in those areas in the 60s and got into Makalu in the 70s, 80s, and now we worked with conservation of the black bear and snow leopard, developed a conservation participation methodology that worked extremely well. People felt they owned the national park, and we now want to apply that to the Great Himalayan Trail from east to west. And we'd like to see if that can possibly be connected to these Afghan, Pakistan, Hindu Kush areas, because we see the belt is not just a Himalayan environmental belt, it's a people's belt, and that this work you're saying about democracy, conservation, participation, governance, they all go together, and that's what we're going to try to do in the Great Himalayan Trail to bring conservation, governance, and ecotourism. Now, ecotourism is not going to take off big time in Afghanistan yet, but it will one day. What do you see the potential for linking the work of along the Great Himalayan Trail to the Snow Leopard Trail and on into the Afghanistan region that we'd really like to be working in as soon as we can?
So I think that there's great potential to do so. I think that's a brilliant idea. My wife actually was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal. I was very jealous of the people who actually were doing as were you. Nice. And I was deeply jealous of the people who actually were doing the Great Himalayan Trail. I've met one group from Japan that was trying to do so. But clearly those people within those mountain communities probably bear a lot of similarities in culture and styles in what they're trying to do. Just how the Silk Road helped spread dumplings from all the way from Eastern Europe all the way through China is, no matter what you call them, momos or whatever, is quite stunning to actually find these threads that connect people. And we need to double down on those things. And maybe it's not trying to do a 4-country peace bark at the political level, but is the individual initiative of park rangers to park rangers who face the same sort of threats. I think that's a great idea. And trackers. I want to make one point. You can go to the Wakhan from Tajikistan through Ishkashim, where UNDP has built a tourism station, and you can go hiking or mountain climbing in Afghanistan. Just this year, I think it was in 2019 or 2018, just at the end of 2018, we had the first female Afghan climb the highest mountain in Afghanistan, which I think is a huge accomplishment. This area, there are peaks that people have never climbed. There is wildlife just waiting to see. It is a very different part of Afghanistan in terms of security and the people, and you can get there from Tajikistan and have an amazing and safe trekking experience. don't sue me if something happens.
Okay, well, we're in the back row. There are a couple of questions.
Hi, thanks. My name is Nirmal Ghosh. I'm a foreign correspondent here in DC, and I also work in conservation in India. Just wondering if you could talk a little bit about instances you may have found of symbiotic relationships between, say, local herders and the land, livestock and the land, which are good for conservation of species. And conversely, if you could talk a bit about the impact of conflict in terms of, have you come across any instances where areas have been depopulated because of conflict, depopulated of humans, and wildlife has rebounded? And also, well, they're all related questions, I apologize. But a third question, these national parks, what is the model? Is it exclusionary or is it with local participation? And how have they worked? Thanks.
National parks never work when they're exclusionary. Right? I mean, literally, it's a form of colonialism, and you're going to fail, right? You're going to end up with paper parks. In Madagascar, the forest reserves, not the national parks that they have now, but the original forest reserves that were run by Ose Forêt, I overlaid the map of the forest reserves with the map of forest cover. There was zero forest cover in any of the forest reserves that were that way, and that's because that approach, I think we can all guess. That's why, people like Peter Zoller and WCS and the countless people we worked with, focused on community conservation as a critical part of what we're trying to do. In terms of depopulating, you can look at obviously the demilitarized zone in between North and South Korea or Chernobyl as a place where wildlife has actually come back. In this case, you can imagine those areas that were mined being some of those areas. But at the same time, it's not clear-cut, right? Because you also have the presence of guns in the country. You have the loss of the rule of law. You have just less engagement with individuals as a result of what's going on. And then the herders, the herders understand, like, they're so closely tied to the status of the rangelands that they get it. They become part of. You cannot do it without them, right? Particularly in a place in Wakhan where you have both you have a nomadic society where if the animals die, you do not make it through the winter. And in that part of Afghanistan, there was at one point people were citing statistics of 30 to 40% women dying in childbirth, right? It was among the highest in the world, if not the highest in the world, because of the conditions. Among the Wahis, who were not nomadic, but they still had their wealth determined by their animals. So they understood when you overgraze the rangelands, there is less animals for Marco Polo sheep. There's less animals for the prey base that supports the snow leopard, but there's also less food for them, and then there's less food for the livestock themselves. Everyone fails in that circumstances, and this is part of the reason I think we had the success that we did in Afghanistan was they got it because they were heavily focused on, at least in the places we're working. We didn't work in the far south, so I can't really speak to maybe my experiences would have been different if I had been working in Helmand province or Nimruz or those areas. But it was, I think at least in the places we were working, people understood that relationship. One of the stories in the book, if you can, that I really remember that really got me was I spent this day with this police chief that we were climbing up hills and I was in far better shape than I am now, and I was still getting really tired following this guy. And then at the end of the day, we were looking for the cheetah. We're looking for signs of the cheetah. He had spent the whole day with me. He was a super lovely person. And then at the end of the day, he goes, "I want to show you something." And he pulls up his pant legs, and he's got 2 artificial legs. And he goes, "I was fighting the Russians and the Taliban. I can't remember which. It was probably the Taliban. And I hit a mine, and I lost my first leg. And then when I recovered, I came back, and I lost, I got hit again, and I lost my second leg. But I believe in the Americans. I believe in you being in Afghanistan. I believe in what you are doing, and that's why I'm here with you." And it still stays with me because this guy was jovial and kind and unbelievably energetic and much better at climbing mountains than I was. And he had suffered all of this and still believed in what we represented and what we could do together. And that's why I worry that we cannot abandon that country.
You're here. If we could come down in the front here with the microphone and we'll work up the side. Maybe we'll capture a couple.
Alex, hi. David Laidlin, long time experience, wildlife conservation in Iran and scientific information exchanges. I was last in Iran July of 2017, invited to a SDS conference, Sand and Dust Storm. And when I had a chance to speak, I reiterated what had been told to me by Glenn Schweitzer of the National Academy of Sciences, who with the State Department for implemented some 30 scientific information exchange programs, that American scientists were really interested in maintaining their cooperation with the Iranian scientists. Well, afterwards, I had 3 deputy ministers come up and thank me for my comments. And I have a lot of friends in Iran, academics and so forth, and this is the case. They really want to have this cooperation for many reasons. And it was there in the State Department until the beginning of 2017, everything came to a screaming halt. And that's the case now, as we all know. My question is, outside of the State Department and the official agencies, are there foundations, other organizations understanding the Track 2 and the diplomatic implications and how important these programs are for developing sane relationships? Is there anybody else that's really doing something about that?
Okay, because we have a lot of hands. We're going to collect some again. So could you just work your way up? You see you've got 3 there, right, clustered?
Thank you. I'm Dr. Salah Hakim. I worked in Afghanistan. I was managing a project for the United Nations. We worked in food security and conservation of natural resources. We worked very closely with the local communities. We had our people going into the villages and talking to people, men and women, because of the gender segregation in that society. My question is, and that was very useful when we worked with the local government, especially the local government. How much did you work with the local community in raising awareness and winning them over to the objectives of the project? And how successful was that? Thank you.
Terrific. Right behind you, gentlemen, right in the red.
I'm Caroline Gable with the Snow Leopard Conservancy, and Dr. Rodney Jackson sends you his greetings. My question was going to be, how can the philanthropic community support the efforts you have to bring together the coalition you're looking for to bring conservation up to the health community standards? But I really want to know what machine, you were talking about PEER, I think, that enables people to do really rapid, cheap, on-the-ground DNA, because we could certainly use that. So whichever question you want to answer, maybe I get both.
Okay. And let's get one more, the gentleman in the red sweater right there, and then we'll come back around.
Pardon me.
Steve Fox, retired Foreign Service Officer with State Department. You mentioned very briefly your contact with the Chinese. Are the Chinese playing any kind of a role in Afghanistan beyond large amounts of money in exchange for extracting mineral resources?
Good question. Okay. Why don't we go with those?
Steve was my former boss, by the way, at the State Department, and of course has the hard questions. I don't really know. I mean, I think the copper mine, the Aranak mine in central Afghanistan, which USGS folks literally paid with blood and sweat and everything else to help uncover those deposits, then was essentially won in an open bid to the Chinese within what they're doing. It's very hard. The question I don't understand is, I'm not familiar enough with the Great Belt Initiative that they have going on through the former Soviet states to understand what impact that they're having on the Afghans. The other issue is the places we were working where the wildlife is in China, in Western China, is Xinjiang, which is where the Uyghurs are, right? And that has become increasingly politically sensitive. And you hear, that has become much harder. The Uyghurs are very, much closely related to the people of Afghanistan, of that part of the world. There's an enormous opportunity, I think, to do that kind of transboundary conservation. But like even with China, when we were trying to do the transboundary meeting, it was super politically. They specifically tried not to elevate anything that happened during that meeting because they were worried that if it got too much attention, it would be shut down. It wasn't because they were against what we were trying to do as much as they had their own political constraints in which to work on. But I'm not really, and I haven't been following what the Chinese have been doing in the region. One of the issues with Arnak mine is that there is amazing historical ruins in Afghanistan. They're now affected potentially by the mines and by the infrastructure that's required to them. Just very quickly, the rapid DNA testing, it's ironic. We literally are talking to someone at McMaster University, Natalie, I can't remember her last name, about how we might cooperate on using that device for snow leopards. The great thing about it is that it works like a PlayStation, a handheld gaming device. If you know anything about the PlayStation loses money on every one of the units it sells because it makes all the money on the licensing. Our approach is we open up the platform for other people to develop any test that they want, and we distribute the devices as cheaply as possible or even for free. And we're hoping to have testable units by the end of the year, so we can get into dialogue. I know Rodney and respect Rodney amazingly much. FAO, thank you so much for your comments. And I would just say nothing we did wasn't everything we did was with the involvement of local communities, because you will not be successful without it. And that was critical. And we had people that were from those communities, that were working with those communities, that were embedded in those communities. And this was really critical to our success. Speaking the language, understanding the culture, understanding the religion is, de minimis for being able to have success in development or conservation. David, I don't know, on Iran, who's supporting those initiatives? Since I left essentially doing that work at State. Obviously, at the time, it was Search for Common Ground. It was Asia Society. Obviously, NAS, it'll be interesting if Ali Daraki, who's been doing some work with them and is a young scientist of Iranian descent who's interesting. NIH obviously had long-term grants looking at throat cancers and the effect of chemical weapons. What people don't realize about Iran was, at least up until recently, their scientists were, their number of scientific publications are rapidly going up, and they're high-quality publications. They're clearly, along with Israel and Turkey, one of the leaders in the Middle East, and they have amazing, it's an economy that, despite sanctions, is amazingly growing. They publish more papers of American scientists than any other country in the world. At least in the current government, at least if you looked at the last time I checked, you looked at the ministers, they had more people in their cabinet that were trained in the U.S. than any other country in the world, except for the U.S., right? And they've got like a whole startup scene because of sanctions. My favorite being Maman Paz, which means mommy cooks. And it is kind of a Uber food delivery service where you can sign up to cook, your favorite gourmet sabzi or fesan jun at home, and then get it delivered to someone at work. And there's a whole network. that has been set up around it. There's a tech scene there that is incredible, and we can actually use the diaspora of Iranian Americans who created Tinder and eBay and a whole host of the current head of Uber is an Iranian American. How do we actually harness that community to engage? There's got to be a political will to help do so right now, and that's obviously a difficult part. I wish I had better solutions or better suggestions for that.
Well, we've come to the end of the time. I know there's some more questions. I guess what we'll do is we'll urge folks to come meet Alex outside where he'll be signing books. So pick up a book and come pose a question there. I know you are speaking at Politics and Prose later this month, so there'll be another opportunity here in town to see and hear Alex in person. Urge you to do that. Thank you to Politics and Prose for coming today to make the books available for purchase here. Alex, we are always thrilled to have you here at the Wilson Center. You're someone who brings innovations to the table in the broad areas that we've always tried to pursue, the kind of connections between environment, development, foreign policy, peace, and conflict. And so the environmental peace building through conservation that you've done, that, as you say, is instrumental and achieved through building democracy, building participation, and giving people a stake and a voice in the management of their resources, which have instrumental impacts, but also larger cultural identity impacts, is really the kinds of experiences and lessons learned we want to feature on the stage and engage in debate. So thank you very much for doing so today.
It's always an honor and a pleasure to be interviewed by one of your heroes. So thank you, Jeff.